That morning they were baking bread in the city. In the oven of one bakery, archaeologists later found more than 80 round loaves. They had been put in to bake and never taken out. The bread charred and turned to stone, but it kept its shape. It lay in that oven for almost 2,000 years. The people who baked it meant to come back in half an hour. To take out the finished loaves, sell them, live an ordinary day. None of them knew that the ordinary day was already over, that within a few hours the bakery, the bread, and the whole city would vanish under a layer of volcanic ash several meters thick. This is the story of a single day, a day in which an entire living city, with its people, houses, shops, and streets, became a dead field buried in ash. A city that was later searched for and could not be found for centuries. A city that preserved for us what no other has, death itself, frozen at the very moment it arrived. Today I'll tell you what happened in Pompeii. Not in the vague terms of there was a volcano, the city died, but for real, step by step. How that day began. What warnings there were that no one understood. Why people didn't run while they still could. And what actually killed them, because it wasn't what most people think. If you enjoy stories like this at night, subscribe. I post them often. And now let's go back there, to that very day. Pompeii was an ordinary Roman town. Not a capital, nothing grand, just a solid, prosperous city in the south. It had, by various estimates, between 10 and 20,000 inhabitants. There were stone-paved streets, shops, bakeries, taverns that sold food and wine, wealthy houses with painted walls and courtyards, and cramped little rooms of the poor. A forum, temples, baths, a theater. Ordinary, living, noisy city life. The streets were narrow and paved. They were crossed by tall stepping stones. People used them to cross the road without stepping into the mud and water, while the gaps between the stones let cartwheels through. Those ruts, worn into the stone over centuries, have survived to this day. Along the streets stood snack bars with stone counters set with large jars. Hot food and drink were kept in them, a kind of ancient street food to go. People walked up, took their food, and went on about their business. The walls of the houses were covered in writing. It was scratched and painted right onto the plaster. Campaign slogans, who to elect to the city council, announcements of when and where the gladiator fights would be, prices, bills, love notes, insults, jokes. The ordinary chatter of ordinary people, which they never meant to preserve for history. And yet it is exactly what has reached us, alive, every day, real. Reading these notes, you realize people have barely changed. The city stood by the sea on fertile land, and above it rose a mountain, big, green, covered in gardens and vineyards all the way to the top. People had lived at its foot for centuries, grazing their cattle on its slopes, growing grapes. And almost none of them knew the main thing. That mountain was a volcano. That's the heart of it. The people of Pompeii did not fear the mountain because they did not understand what it was. The volcano had been silent for so long, hundreds of years, that the memory of its past eruptions had simply faded. No stories, no legends were left. To them it was just a mountain, beautiful, useful, familiar. They built their houses right at its foot and felt perfectly safe. But the mountain was not dead. It was only sleeping. And deep below it, pressure was building. Building slowly, year by year, century by century. Molten rock rose higher and higher. Gases sought a way out. The mountain was getting ready. And the people above lived their lives and noticed nothing, though there were signs. And they came in advance. A few years before the catastrophe, a powerful earthquake struck the region. It was so strong that it seriously damaged the city itself. Houses collapsed, temples cracked, the baths and public buildings were hurt. The city spent a long time rebuilding. By the time of the catastrophe, many buildings were still in scaffolding, still not fully repaired. Today we understand that the earthquake was a warning, a sign that deep underground something was stirring, something was changing. But back then, people didn't connect earthquakes with the mountain. The ground shook, so what? The ground sometimes shakes. It was unpleasant, it was dangerous, but it seemed a separate misfortune with nothing to do with the quiet green summit above the town. And there were smaller signs, closer to the day itself. Springs and wells dried up. Water suddenly left its familiar places. The livestock grew restless. From time to time, the ground trembled with a fine shudder, not much, but noticeable. All of it was a signal that the volcano was waking. But people didn't read it. To them, these were just oddities, small inconveniences. No one put them together. No one understood where they led. And then that day came. An ordinary morning. People woke and set about their business. Bakers put in the bread. Merchants opened their shops. Someone went to the baths, someone to the forum, someone to work. The sky above the city was still calm. And then the mountain exploded. Around midday came a terrible blast. The top of the mountain was torn apart from within by monstrous force. A column shot up into the sky, a column of scorching ash, stones, and gas. It rose swiftly to an enormous height, many kilometers above the clouds, and up there it spread outward, casting a black shadow over everything. Someone who saw it from afar described the column as a huge tree, a thick trunk reaching to the sky, and a wide crown spreading at the very top. That description has come down to us because this catastrophe had a witness who later wrote it all down, a young man who lived nearby, on the other side of the bay. He watched the eruption from a distance and later described everything he saw in letters. Thanks to him, we know how it looked from the outside, almost hour by hour. From his letters, scholars later reconstructed the course of the eruption almost by the hour. First, that blast and the tree-shaped column. Then, hours of falling stone, darkness in the middle of the day, tremors in the ground. Then, the collapse of the column and the scorching waves in the night and toward morning. One witness, watching it all from afar, left us the timetable of a catastrophe he himself barely survived. His letters are the rarest of cases, where an ancient disaster is told by a living eyewitness rather than a later retelling. He described how, toward morning, the waves reached even the place where he and his mother were, how everything was swallowed in darkness, how people in panic held on to each other and cried out in the dark, taking that darkness for the end of the world. His older relative, a learned and curious man, commanded the fleet not far away. Seeing the strange cloud over the mountain, he decided to go closer, first out of scientific interest, and then to help the people on the coast who were trapped. He sailed toward the shore, to the very foot of the erupting mountain, and from there he did not return. He died there, by the shore, suffocated in the poisoned air. Curiosity and the wish to help cost him his life. And what was happening in the city itself, under that column? At first it was not ash that fell on Pompeii, but stone. Small, porous, light stones, frozen volcanic foam. They rained from the sky like hail, only they didn't melt. Sparse at first, then thicker and thicker. After a while, they already covered the streets in a solid layer, and that layer grew before people's eyes, centimeter by centimeter, then knee-deep, then higher. Picture a city on which, for several hours, stone rains from the sky. It drums on the roofs, it clogs the streets, it piles higher and higher. The day darkens because the column overhead has blotted out the sun. An unnatural darkness sets in the middle of the day, blacker than any night. And here begins the hardest question of this story. Why did people stay? Falling stone is not instant death. People had hours. Many, in those first hours, really did flee, grabbing what they could and leaving the city, toward the sea, away from the mountain. And some of them were saved. But many stayed. Why? There were several reasons. First, at the start, it seemed like something you could wait out. Stones are falling. We'll hide in the house, under the roof, and wait for it to stop. People hid inside their homes, under stairs, in rooms without windows. It seemed safer that way, that the walls would protect them. Second, there was the darkness. In daytime, it became black as night. In that darkness, under the hail of stone, running was terrifying and hard. Where do you go if you can't see the road, if it's raining from the sky, if there's already a thick layer of rubble underfoot? Many decided that waiting in shelter was wiser than running blind. Third, people didn't understand the scale. They didn't know this was a volcanic eruption. They didn't know what would come next. They didn't know the worst was still ahead. To them, it was a terrifying, incomprehensible storm, and they hoped it would pass like a thunderstorm. And the stone kept falling. And now a new danger appeared. The layer of stone on the roofs grew heavier and heavier, and at some point the roofs began to fail. They caved in under the weight of the accumulated rubble, collapsing onto those who were hiding inside. The people who had hidden in their homes hoping to wait it out were trapped. Shelter had become a snare. But even that was not the worst. The falling stone buried the city, broke the roofs, killed people, but it was only the first part of the catastrophe. The real killer came later, at night. By night, the character of the eruption changed. The enormous column that had held in the sky for hours began to collapse. It had become too heavy to hold up there, and all that mass of scorching ash, stone, and gas came crashing down onto the slopes of the mountain and rushed toward the city. This is called a pyroclastic flow. Picture not a lava flow that creeps along slowly, but a swift wave, a wave of ash, gas, and debris, heated to hundreds of degrees, tearing down the slope at enormous speed, faster than a person can run, faster than a galloping horse. It rolls down in a dense, hot cloud and sweeps away everything in its path. Such waves are dangerous in a completely different way from ordinary lava. You can walk away from a slow lava flow. It crawls. But this wave doesn't crawl. It flies. It moves at tens, sometimes more than 100 kilometers an hour. You cannot outrun it. And it carries not only speed, but a temperature of hundreds of degrees. Even hiding behind a thick wall won't shield you from such heat. It gets in everywhere. It is exactly this combination of speed and heat that makes such waves almost absolutely deadly for everyone in their path. And it was these waves that truly killed Pompeii. The first of them didn't reach the city itself. They stopped a little to the side or at the walls. But the ones that followed rolled in. The scorching cloud burst into the city, its streets, courtyards, houses. It moved so fast that escape was already impossible. And it carried not only impact, but heat. Terrible heat. It was this heat that became the main cause of death. For a long time, people thought the inhabitants of Pompeii mostly suffocated from the ash, the gas, the lack of air. But the more scholars studied the remains, the clearer it became. Many died first of all from the temperature. The scorching wave was so hot that death came almost instantly. People died the same second the wave covered them, and this, as grim as it sounds, was more merciful than slow suffocation. Those overtaken by the scorching wave most likely didn't even have time to understand anything. One moment they're hiding, it's dark and terrifying all around, and the next they're gone. For them, there was no agonizing pause between life and death. There was a flash of heat, and that was all. And then ash settled over the dead city. Fine, soft, volcanic ash buried everything. Bodies, houses, streets. It lay in layers, higher and higher, filling every crack, flowing around every object. By morning, where a living city had been, there lay an even gray field. No streets, no houses, no people. Just ash, several meters thick. Pompeii ceased to exist in under a day. In the morning, an ordinary living city. By the next morning, nothing. Only ash under a dull sky. And here begins the most unusual part of this story. Because the way the city died gave us what no other catastrophe has. The soft ash that buried the dead hardened over time, and the bodies inside it decayed. And where a person had once been, a void remained in the hardened ash, an exact imprint of the body at that very last moment. Like a mold for casting. The void held the outline of the figure, the pose, the folds of clothing, everything just as it was in the second of death. Centuries passed. The city was found, the digging began. And one researcher came up with a brilliant idea. Whenever the excavation hit such a void, they poured liquid plaster into it. The plaster filled the void, set, and out came the exact figure of a person. A cast of someone who had lain here 2,000 years ago, in the very pose in which death had caught them. It's worth explaining why this became possible precisely here. In most catastrophes, at best, only bones remain of people. The flesh decays, and nothing is left of the pose, the gesture, the expression. But in Pompeii, the ash was so fine and lay so densely and quickly that it set around the body like a mold, before the body had time to decompose. The body later decayed, but the mold remained. What was left was a hollow shell of the exact shape of a person. No one planned it, it simply happened. Fine ash, instant death, swift burial. A coincidence that preserved for us what usually vanishes without a trace. And these casts are the most powerful thing in Pompeii. Because they are not statues, not drawings, not an artist's imagination, they are exact imprints of real people at the moment of their death. Here is a person lying face down, covering their head with their hands. Here is someone curled up, knees pulled to the chest. Here are people lying side by side, perhaps a family that stayed together to the end. Here is a figure shielding another, smaller one, an adult covering a child with their own body. Here is a person still sitting, leaning back, as if simply tired. And among them, a dog on a chain that no one unleashed. Its cast preserved the pose in which it writhed and thrashed, trying to break free, tied to the post to the very end. This one figure says more about that day than whole books. This is what makes Pompeii so special and so hard to bear. In other ancient cities, we see walls, potsherds, bones. But here, we see the very moment of death, the pose in which a person met the end, the gesture with which they shielded themselves, the way they held their loved ones close. This is not history in vague terms. It is deeply personal, deeply human. Every cast is someone's broken off life, frozen for 2,000 years. These poses, by the way, were also argued over. It used to be thought that the contorted poses were agony, the death throes and convulsions of a suffocating person. But then it was understood, most likely these poses came from the intense heat. The scorching wave acted on the body so that the muscles sharply contracted after death. That is, the person died instantly, and their body then took on this twisted shape. This means there was probably less suffering than these terrible poses suggest. Death was quick. Pompeii did not die alone. Nearby was another town, smaller, right by the sea. Its fate was even more terrible in one respect. If Pompeii was buried in ash and stone, this town was covered by a scorching wave all at once and completely, and then flooded by flows that set into a very dense, thick crust. It preserved the town so well that even things that usually don't survive endured there. Wood, imprints of the most fragile objects. The people of this town tried to save themselves by the sea. They ran to the water, to the boathouses on the shore, hoping to sail away. Many crowded into these stone sheds right at the water's edge, waiting for rescue from the sea. Rescue never came. The scorching wave overtook them right there, on the shore, at their last hope. Their remains were found centuries later, whole groups of people packed into shelters by the water, who never lived to see the boats. And then both towns simply vanished. They were buried and gradually forgotten. Years passed, decades, centuries. The ash grew over with grass, then with bushes. Then people came to live on the spot again, no longer knowing what lay beneath their feet. A whole city, with streets, houses, and dead inhabitants, lay just a few meters underground, while above, goats grazed and vineyards grew. People walked over the dead city and never suspected it was there. Pompeii was lost for almost 2,000 years. It was remembered only from old records that there was, somewhere, such a city, destroyed in an eruption. But where exactly, what remained of it, no one really knew. It had become a vague legend. It was found by chance. Digging in the ground, workers hit the remains of walls, of paintings, of objects. At first they didn't understand what it was. Then they realized, this is that very destroyed city. And excavations began, that continue, by the way, to this day. Even now, not all of its territory has been dug up. Part of Pompeii still lies underground, waiting its turn. And what was found astonished people, because the ash that destroyed the city also preserved it. It froze Pompeii just as it was on that last day. Houses stood in their places. On the walls, paintings survived, bright, alive. In the shops, counters remained. On the streets, ruts from carts. In the houses, dishes, jewelry, coins, food. That same petrified bread in the oven. Writing on the walls, ordinary, everyday, scratched by people just for the sake of it. The finds came one after another, and each was like a window into that day. In the houses stood untouched furniture, or rather its imprints in the hardened rock, from which it was possible to reconstruct how it looked. On tables and in cabinets, dishes, glass vessels, lamps. In shops, scales and weights, coins and boxes. In the baths, the device for heating water, benches, niches for clothing. In gardens, from the voids left by decayed roots, they even reconstructed which trees and plants grew there. In the snack bars, the jars set into the counters still remained, where food had once been kept. They also found the smallest, most personal things. Jewelry that someone had grabbed while fleeing. Purses of coins clutched in a hand to the last. Children's toys. Surgical instruments in a doctor's house. Paints and brushes in a workshop. Each such thing is someone's broken off life. Someone's occupation. Someone's morning that never turned into evening. From these small things you can see that people hoped to return to the very end. They took the most valuable with them, expecting to wait out the disaster and come home. Pompeii turned out to be not just ruins. It was a whole Roman city, frozen in a single day, as if time in it had been stopped. Because of this, we know more about the daily life of that era than about any other. What the streets looked like, how the houses were arranged, what people ate, what they traded, what they wrote on the walls, how ordinary people spent their day. All of it Pompeii preserved, because it was covered instantly, together with the life that was teeming in it. A catastrophe that killed thousands of people became a window into the past. We pay for this knowledge with other people's deaths, with those very casts, those bodies by the sea, that dog on the chain. And it makes you treat Pompeii not as a museum, but as a vast grave that happened to be left open. And what about the mountain? It hasn't gone anywhere. It still stands there above new cities, new houses, above millions of people who once again live at its foot. Just as 2,000 years ago, it is asleep again, and beneath it, pressure is building again. Sooner or later, it will wake once more. It is only a matter of time. The only difference is that now people know it is a volcano. They know how dangerous it is, and, if it comes to it, they hope to get out in time. Such was the fall of Pompeii, a city that lived an ordinary life and died in a single day. People who didn't understand the warnings because they didn't know what they meant, who stayed because they hoped to wait it out, who were killed not so much by the ash as by the scorching heat, and who have stayed with us forever, frozen in plaster in their final poses. And here is something to think about before sleep. The people of Pompeii, that morning, were going about ordinary business, baking bread, opening shops, quarreling, loving, making plans for tomorrow. They were sure tomorrow would come, that many days lay ahead. The mountain above them seemed eternal and safe. And the disaster came from where they least expected it, from the familiar, ordinary, beautiful mountain they had looked at all their lives. That petrified bread in the oven is a small but most honest monument to that day. Someone put it in to bake and stepped out for a minute, and did not come back. Not in a minute, not in an hour, not in 2,000 years. Between put in the bread and the end of everything, only a few hours passed. And the whole city froze on that simple, everyday motion, halfway from morning to an evening that never came. Maybe that is why Pompeii moves people even thousands of years later. Not because something distant and foreign happened there, but because something very close to everyone happened there. Ordinary people, an ordinary day, ordinary cares, and a sudden end no one expected. That same bread in the oven that was never taken out. We too make plans for tomorrow every day. And that's probably right. You can't live otherwise. But the story of Pompeii quietly reminds us of one simple thing, that every ordinary day is a gift. That behind the familiar and reliable, sometimes something hides that we cannot see. And that it's worth stopping now and then to notice this ordinary day while it's here. Thank you for spending this evening with me. If you liked the story and it made you think, subscribe. There are many more evenings like this ahead. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. And until we meet again.